Hi everybody, it's Nina Teicholz. We're having technical difficulties because I'm calling you from New York City, where apparently phone service is not very reliable. But I will just try to recap what I started to talk about earlier. And so I'm Nina Teicholz. I'm the author of The Big Fat Surprise and a science journalist. I've also become an advocate really for evidence-based nutrition policy. And I'm going to talk today about nutrition politics. One of the things that I've discovered in the more than 10 years now that I've been researching science, nutrition science, is that it really is a story more about politics than about science. Like why we are where we are today can be explained better by politics than by science. And so I want to answer, the question that I always get asked, and I think is really central for all of us, which is, why is it that authorities are not paying attention to the science? Why do we not see in our official dietary recommendations the science that many of us know about and is out there in abundance? There's a tremendous amount of science now on how well carbohydrate restriction works for combating and reversing obesity and diabetes. Why is that not in our dietary guidelines? So I want to explain that a little bit today. And the basic assumption that most people come to it with is that it must be the food companies, it must be the power of industry. And we've seen a lot in the news about how the sugar industry was involved. There was an article that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association not too long ago that documented how the sugar industry had given money to some Harvard scientists back in the 1950s, and so it seemed as if the sugar industry had been able to deflect criticism of their product and turn it instead to dietary fat as the suspect. I think that there's definitely been a role of the food industry. I actually think the sugar industry did not influence those Harvard scientists. I've studied their work in great detail, and I can tell you that they were all publishing against fat and cholesterol starting in the early 1950s onwards, and that sugar industry money really probably did not make a difference to them. They were all set in their opinions about fat and cholesterol before then. But in my research, the industry that really has played a much bigger role is the vegetable oil industry. Some of the biggest companies in the world that you've probably heard of: Procter & Gamble in the U.S., Unilever, ADM, Monsanto, all of those companies, huge companies, Bunge, they make vegetable oils. And in my book, I document how, Crisco, Procter & Gamble, whose product was Crisco, which is, the original lard replacement, and then they also made Crisco oil, but how they basically infiltrated the American Heart Association, which then became the leader in condemning saturated fat. So there was this role all along of the vegetable oil industry promoting the hypothesis that saturated fats are bad for health. And because if you don't eat saturated fats, then presumably instead of meat, the obvious one is instead of butter, you have margarine. The other substitutions are less obvious, like instead of meat, you have vegetable oils. You drink vegetable oils for dinner. I don't know. But, that was the idea. You would get rid of these animal foods, which contain saturated fat, and switch over to vegetable-based, really seed-based fats instead. And I think the vegetable oil industry was quite successful in doing that. And the food industry has definitely played a role in influencing nutrition scientists. However, I really think that the main, if you want to say, culprits of this story are the nutrition scientists themselves. They are the ones who accept money from industry. They're the ones who interpret the studies. And really where our dietary guidelines come from are our governments, and in the U.S., and also in other countries. But, for us, the original one is the American Heart Association, which issued the very first dietary recommendations against saturated fat in 1961. And from there, everything else has flown. So our government, the U.S. government, didn't get on board until 1980 with the low-fat diet restricted in saturated fat and cholesterol. And who makes those recommendations are panels of experts. And who are those experts? They are chosen. There's usually committees that are chosen from prominent universities around the country. And those are the people who decide on what our dietary recommendations are. And they're like the gatekeepers of science. And they truly should know better. They should know when there's science funded by the vegetable oil industry that science should not be considered. They should know the difference between the rigor of a clinical trial and how that shows cause and effect versus epidemiology, which does not. So, and that has not, instead, if you look at the history, what you find is that those scientists have really systematically ignored and denied the science. I think really the story of nutrition science is the tremendous amount of science that has been done and then buried. There are examples that I came across for my book, and I've since learned of others, but just to give you two examples of science that's been buried and ignored. So one, the most famous example, I think, is the Minnesota Coronary Survey, which was actually launched by Ancel Keys. It was an NIH, National Institute of Health, funded study. It was the biggest ever test of Ancel Keys' hypothesis, the diet heart hypothesis, which holds that saturated fat cause heart disease. It was started in the 1960s, and it tested in 5 inpatient settings in Minnesota. So these are like mental hospitals. It's the kind of experiment you can't do anymore because it's considered unethical. And it followed 9,000 men and women in these inpatient settings where you control all the food, so it's a highly controlled experiment. You control what they eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's very different from an experiment where you hand over a diet book and maybe give them an hour of counseling a day and say, good luck to you. Let us know if you're following the rules. And they followed those. And in this experiment, the Minnesota Coronary Survey, they had half of the people eating a diet that had 18% saturated fat. That was considered normal back in the 60s in America. Just to compare that, today the caps on saturated fat are at anywhere from 7 to 10%. So, but they considered normal to have 18% of calories as saturated fat, and the other half of the population got half that, 9% of their calories as saturated fat. And this is the group that was eating margarine and soy-filled cheese and soy-filled burgers. And at the end of that experiment, they found that the group that had been eating the vegetable oil diet had no improvements in cardiovascular mortality, which is to say they died at the same rates of heart disease, and their total mortality was the same. So it had no benefit, no health benefit for them. And this study was not published for 16 years, which is a kind of, fraud, really. You're supposed to publish the results of your study. Remember, this is a government-funded major study that cost, I'm sure hundreds of millions of dollars. They didn't publish this study, and much later, when the journalist Gary Taubes asked when they did publish it, they put it in this very out-of-the-way journal that they knew no one would read. At that point, Ancel Keys had dropped his name off the study. And much later, when Gary Taubes, the journalist, asked one of the other study leaders, Ivan France, why did you not publish this study for so long? Ivan France replied, well, there was really nothing wrong with the study. We were just so disappointed in the way it turned out. Which is astonishing. It's really that they buried this study. It was unearthed much, much later. In 2015, researchers went back and looked at the study and did a kind of post hoc analysis with some data that had been left in a basement somewhere. And they published this in the BMJ, and they found that actually the more the men reduced their cholesterol in the study, the more the men, or maybe it was all the people who reduced their cholesterol, the more likely they were to die of a heart attack. So it was even worse for them than we thought. And that study also showed something that many other studies showed, which is that the people on the vegetable oil diets died at higher rates from cancer. So this is an example of studies that have been buried. And there are other examples where literally, like the data from the Framingham study, a very big study, when they found out that they could not they could not find an association between saturated fat consumption and cardiovascular outcomes of any kind. They literally did not publish that study. That ended up in a basement, in volume 23, in some dusty basement at NIH, and was not published. So this is just to give you a sense of the way that science is buried and suppressed, and really has been. And so one of the things that and that this has been consistent. So one of the things that I found when I went back and looked at the evidence underpinning the U.S. dietary guidelines, which are considered the absolute gold standard. Everywhere you go in the world, they say, well, we refer back to the dietary guideline, U.S. dietary guidelines, because those are the gold standard. What I found was that I went back and looked through every single expert committee, again, these appointed committees of university experts, and I looked at their expert reports, and I looked at the science that they had reviewed, and I found that none of them, not one of them, they've met 1980, 1985, every 5 years. Not one of those reports reviewed the clinical trial evidence on saturated fats. That means, and do you know how much evidence there is on saturated fats? There's actually been randomized controlled clinical trials funded by governments around the world on more than 65,000 people in multi-center, multi-center studies that were fairly well controlled. Not all of them were perfect, but none of those studies have ever been reviewed by any dietary guideline committee. That was an amazing realization. And I published that as part of the article that I wrote for the BMJ that came out in 2015, and we'll talk later about what happened to that. But I want to just tell you some of the other findings of that article, which is there is also a huge body of clinical trial evidence showing that the low-fat diet has been a total failure, right? I mean, many of you are familiar with the Women's Health Initiative study, which was on nearly 49,000 women, lasting about 8 years on average for each of them, where they were literally given a copy of the U.S. dietary guidelines and told, restrict your fat, restrict your saturated fat and cholesterol. And at the end of that study, where they had significantly, the intervention group had significantly reduced their fat and saturated fat consumption, they found no benefit for any kind of disease, no really significant weight loss. Maybe they made a pound difference at the end of 7 years. No benefit for diabetes, no benefit for cardiovascular disease, no benefit for any kind of cancer. It was originally designed as a cancer trial, actually. No benefit for cancer. So, and that study was, this is the biggest ever nutrition trial in the history of nutrition studies. That study is also not cited in the dietary guidelines. They literally, they cite a kind of post hoc analysis of it, but they don't cite the major results from that. There were 5 papers, none of them are cited in our dietary guidelines. And there were other studies on the low-fat diet, also funded by NIH, also not referenced or cited anywhere in the dietary guidelines. So this is what I also put in the BMJ paper. So now we're going to shift to talking about, we're going to shift to talking about what is another reason why our dietary guidelines do not reflect this science. Why? Why are they not putting this information in there? And I think the answer to that is institutions and not just our government, but also all these university professors have really come to believe this hypothesis. They're invested in it, and there are all sorts of feeding programs like our school lunches and other feeding programs that depend upon things being a certain way. And it is impossible to reverse out of that particular, the low-fat mindset, caps on saturated fat. So I think there are these incredible institutional rigidities that exist now that are supported by interested industries, and this is why we can't back out of our current advice. And now, here we have this huge body of evidence that's pushing up, literally more than 100 randomized controlled clinical trials on the low-carb diet, showing that this diet is hugely effective for combating metabolic diseases. this body of knowledge is sort of pushing up, and there are people like me writing about it and others, and there are people practicing it. So what is the response to us? Well, I think we all know these stories, but I'm going to tell them for you anyway, which is that there is now this kind of almost desperate attempt to bully us and kind of to beat us up and push us down and take away our licenses or whatever it is that we are doing, or trying to take away our ability to act and write. And I don't know if all of you know what's going on around the world, but I'm just going to review for you, just to go through what is happening around the world. And I actually wrote a little piece on this that's going to come out in a book. So that's why I'm looking down. But I think the first case that we heard of was, this is in recent times, which is in 2015, Jennifer Elliott, who is a dietitian in Australia. She had always recommended a near vegetarian diet. She had worked for her and her family, and it seems like they grew all their own food and did everything right, the way Michael Pollan tells you to do. And but she found for her middle daughter was not thriving on this diet. Her other children were, but her middle daughter was gaining a lot of weight on this diet and seemed to be more be more insulin resistant. So she did a lot of research and discovered the low carb diet and discovered it worked for her middle daughter, and then she began to practice that. And then she published an article, actually. I think that was a significant thing. She sort of raised her head up and was known. That article came out in Food and Nutrition Sciences in October 2014, and shortly thereafter she was deregistered by the Dietitians Association of Australia, which means she had lost her job, she could no longer practice. And although the Dietitians Association said, we did not expel Miss Elliott because of the low-carb diet. Instead, they cited a number of trivial ways that she had allegedly failed to meet her standard patient care, based all on the notes on a single client. However, they did say that what she was practicing was inconsistent with evidence-based practice. It was not evidence-based care. And evidence-based care, you have to understand, always refers back. The evidence is the dietary guidelines, and it all goes back to the U.S. dietary guidelines, from which other nations copy and cite most other nations. So it all goes back to those dietary guidelines, which have never looked at actually most of the clinical trial literature out there. Okay, so that's Jennifer Elliott. Also in Australia, Gary Fettke, probably many of you know about him, but I'll just give you the details. There was an anonymous complaint by a dietitian against him in 2014. He's an orthopedic surgeon and a senior lecturer at the University of Tasmania. So he's the guy who, when diabetic patients, because their bodies have been marinating in glucose for years, they lose the ability, their limbs, they're turned black, and it's his responsibility. They lose circulation in their limbs. It's his responsibility is to cut off people's toes and feet and legs, and it's just a horrific thing that he encounters. And when he discovered himself, for his own, he was sort of tinkering around to figure out how to lose weight himself. He discovered the low carb diet. He realized this would greatly benefit his diabetic patients, and started telling them to cut back on sugar. And again, importantly, he raised his head and started talking about it. He started giving lectures. He started a popular website called nofructose.com. And at that point, his health authorities, called APRA, was the acronym, the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, they cracked down on him, and they did a closed-door investigation that lasted 2 years and 5 months, and at the end of that, they issued a caution against Gary Fettke in November 2006, warning him, quote, not to provide specific advice or recommendations on the subject of nutrition and how it relates to the management of diabetes or the treatment and or the prevention of cancer. Because, quote, he's not suitably trained or educated as a medical practitioner to be providing advice or recommendations on this topic. So I find that hilarious, because, he had as much training in nutrition, I mean, much more actually, but he had as much formal training in nutrition as any other doctor does, and all doctors give nutritional advice. In fact, he was far more educated. But he was prohibited from counseling his patients not to eat sugar. He was also accused of inappropriately claiming to have reversed his patients' diabetes. Terrible thing to do. Okay, so he now is technically unable to speak or tweet or do anything that about nutrition for the rest of his life. So I think the last example that I'm going to give is of Tim Noakes. I think many people out there are familiar with his ordeal. It's been sort of called the nutrition trial of the 21st century. I think that's fair to say. I mean, it's really extraordinary, the ordeal that he has. It's a very high profile ordeal that he's endured. And so Tim Noakes is a world famous professor for his work that he's done on exercise. He's a professor at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, and he discovered that he himself, although a veteran marathoner, he'd run more than 50 marathons in his life, that he was getting fat and diagnosed with diabetes. Why is that? How could that be? And so he discovered that it was all this carb loading that he had done, even though he burned off all those calories running. And so we're told that should make no difference. It's all about calories, right? So he decided to recant and say, carb loading is wrong. The high carb diet that I've been advocating my whole life is something I no longer believe in. And he helped write part of a book about it. It became, the low carb diet in South Africa is called Banting. So he wrote a book called The Banting Revolution. I think I might get that slightly wrong. Anyway, that book became a huge runaway bestseller, and he became famous. Again, it was this issue of becoming a prominent spokesperson or a prominent advocate of the low-carb diet. And so at that point, his health authorities cracked down on him. The Health Professional Council of South Africa received a complaint by a dietitian over a tweet that Tim Noakes had written where he said it's okay to wean your baby to LCHF, low carb, high fat. And for that, even though there was no doctor-patient relationship involved, he was subjected to a trial that is lasting 3 years, over 3 years now. Oh, sorry, his book is called The Real Meal Revolution, and it came out in 2013. So his trial has been going on, I think, for nearly 3 years, and it's cost him, millions of rand. He has flown in expert witnesses, including me, and it's just been a huge ordeal for him. And he chose to fight. He could have chosen just to say, it doesn't matter. All they can do is take away my medical license anyway, and I don't even practice medicine. But he chose to fight, to stand up for the science, really, to stand up for his reputation, but also to stand up for the science. So in April, the HPSCA, which not only prosecuted, but also appoints the panel to judge the hearing, despite that conflict of interest, they still ruled at the end of nearly 3 years that Professor Noakes was innocent on all counts. And importantly, they ruled that the advice he had given was not evidence-based, which means it was evidence-based. And they confirmed there had been no doctor-patient relationship, so there was really no authority for HPSCA to be involved anyway. However, the HPSCA has now appealed its own decision, and so there will be another round, albeit briefer, set of hearings on that subject. So, that is a huge ordeal to go through. And I'd like to just finish by mentioning my own ordeal, which I think is part of this kind of systematic attempt to shut down this conversation about the science, challenging conversation about the science that challenges the status quo. So my experience was this article that I mentioned earlier that I wrote for the British Medical Journal that documents how our dietary guidelines are not evidence-based, how they've ignored most of the clinical trial literature. Not only have they ignored the clinical trial literature on more than 65,000 people testing unsaturated fats. Not only have they ignored the more than 55,000 people tested in clinical trials on the low-fat diet, they have also ignored the at that time, more than 70 randomized controlled clinical trials involving thousands of people on the low-carb diet. So they've ignored these 3 huge bodies of clinical trial, rigorous clinical trial research, and instead they have based their recommendations on epidemiology, which is, only shows association, is not the kind of rigorous science that justifies population guidelines. For this, this article was a source of tremendous controversy, and the Center for Science, supposedly in the public interest, CSPI in Washington D.C. I mean, not only were there all these complaints there's a process after every article, a legitimate process where there are people write in with letters and you respond to them, and I did that and I responded to everybody, but that didn't satisfy Center for Science in the Public Interest or the Dietary Guideline Committee, whose work was being impugned. And so they got 180 people, graduate students, many famous professors, but also graduate students and people, environmentalists, to sign a letter demanding retraction of my paper. And this was also a long ordeal. It took more than a year for the BMJ to review the article. It was just a highly fraught process. They asked a lot of people who didn't want to do it because it was such a political hot potato. They got 2 reviewers in the end. One of the reviewers turns out to have been he's the director of a center that is that's really part of the office of the U.S. government agency that produces the guidelines. So he's like a tremendous conflict of interest. I don't know how he wound up as one of the supposedly objective reviewers. But at the end of that, the BMJ decided they came out with their decision finally last December, and they decided not to retract the article. And they made what I think is a legitimate correction. But that didn't change any of the fundamental assertions in the article. So, all of these instances of Jennifer Elliott, Gary Fettke, Tim Noakes, me, now there's a dietitian in Ireland who's being sort of persecuted in a similar way. I mean, these kinds of efforts to bully us into backing away from what we want to talk about, or the practices that people the diet they want to practice in their with their patients. I think there's some evidence to show that they're really part of a concerted campaign. There's always sort of lurking in the background, to the extent that journalism has been the sugar industry, but and certain members of the nutrition kind of establishment who seem to be involved, but they have a very concerted purpose, right? First of all, it's terrifying to be in the news like that. You have to. It's no fun. It's no fun, and there's a pretty big part of you that just wants to go become a kindergarten teacher, where things would be easier. So it intimidates not only you, but it really sends a very, very strong message to anybody else who might consider sticking their neck out, right? Which is to say, be warned. This will happen to you too. And there are plenty of doctors and professors who see our experiences and have made a decision not to publish a paper, not to speak out, not to go to a conference, not to give that talk, not to write that article. And I'm sure I've heard stories. I mean, I'm sure there's so many stories like that now. It's a cautionary tale. We are cautionary tales for anybody who might consider challenging the conventional wisdom. And the other thing is, it literally is a hardship to go through. I mean, Tim Noakes has spent millions of rand. I hired a lawyer in London when the BMJ wanted to do a bunch of corrections that were not factually based, and I had to hire a lawyer basically to say, I'm serious. If you do this, this will be wrong. And not that I could ever have afforded it, but it cost me thousands of dollars just to write a letter to say, you cannot publish non-factual so-called corrections that will harm my reputation and it will be wrong. So it's expensive to go through ordeals like that. And it's harrowing. But I also the last thing that I want to talk about is I want to say that this is not new to nutrition science. I mean, it's absolutely crazy what transpires as normal in this field. I mean, one of the things, there's actually a part of my book, a little section called The Sharp Elbows of Nutrition Science, where I talk about ways in which nutrition scientists, going back to the 50s and 60s, have been literally bullied. I mean, it is bullying that goes on. I mean, it's the way that people slander each other's characters, call them names. There's a whole section in my book with Jerry Stamler, who is a sort of the right-hand man for a long time of Ansel Keys. They work very closely together. I mean, calling his colleagues names. And they would, industry, I documented how the vegetable industry hired people to go and harass scientists at conferences. You know, you pick apart every little part of their paper, every part of their presentation. There were scientists who said, I got out of this field because it was just, it was so unrewarding, and it made me paranoid. You know, I would give my paper and somehow they knew it was going to be published beforehand and the attacks were relentless. And I talked to people whose job it was to sit in the audience and basically heckle scientists who were giving presentations. One of these people, I'll just show you today, Fred Kummerow, who just died. This is his obituary. I don't know if you can see this, but Fred Kummerow was one of the first people who sounded the alarm on trans fats. And he told me stories about how he set up a conference in like the 70s to talk about trans fats, and somebody canceled it, like sent out a cancellation notice behind his back so that he showed up and nobody came. And he could never get funding to do his work, and he was really rejected by his colleagues, although it's amazing how he carried on. I mean, there's another woman, Mary Enig, who was one of the early people to sound the alarm on trans fats. She ended up doing a lot of work with the Weston A. Price Foundation. She's a biochemist at the University of Maryland. And she said, when she tried to publish a paper on trans fats, the editor of the journal that was going to publish her paper literally got calls from executives or scientists employed by the margarine industry saying, don't publish that paper, we won't advertise for you anymore. I talked to this editor who told me about this. And Mary Enig herself got visits at her office from margarine industry scientists saying, we don't know how you got this. We don't know how you let this cat out of the bag. So, I would call that just outright bullying of scientists who are doing work that's unpopular. And so I'm just letting you know about these stories because I see a through line to today, to the kinds of tactics that are being used today. And I guess that's why I think this is not going to be, if there's going to be change, it's so unlikely that it can be like a truly sort of let's all hold hands and have a peaceful revolution, because the establishment, which is defended by huge food companies and big pharma, which profits from people being sick, and they are not going quietly into the night, and they understand what a threat it is to be able to cure these metabolic problems through healthy diet rather than their drugs and rather than the kinds of food, the healthy whole grains that they are professing to be cures for disease. So that's the politics of nutrition as it stands today. I think that, maybe as a final note, and then I see things coming across my screen here, and maybe there are questions I can answer, but feel free to ask a question. I would be happy to answer one. But there are now groups around the world. There's the Public Health Collaboration in the UK. There's a group of doctors that are active in Canada. There's a group that I helped found called the Nutrition Coalition in the US, who are all engaged in trying to really change the conversation about diet, and also lobby our health authorities to recognize the science, like to stop ignoring the science, at least to recognize, step one, the science is not settled. It's not only not settled on what is a healthy diet, it's not settled on salt, it's not settled on exercise, and let's just recognize that the current guidelines are not supported by the quality and quantity of evidence that we think they are, that most people think they are. So, all right, if you have questions, I'm going to scroll down here and see if anybody's got a question to answer. A lot of comments about Big Pharma, agree with that. A story about Big Pharma, people who have gone to the last couple of meetings of the American Diabetes Association have told me that there has not been a single poster presentation on the low-carb diet, not a single word about the low-carb diet. All of the solutions are surgical. You can get a bag to permanently hang outside your stomach for your food. You can do a number of things surgically, and of course you can take medicine, but the American Diabetes Association is not talking about low carb. Let me just see if there's anything else. All right. Well, I'm not very good. This is the first time I've ever done this, so I'm sorry if I'm not being a true pro. But if there's a chance to follow up online and people are watching, and maybe there's a way to answer questions there. So I guess that's it. I want to say thank you for having me. We all need to, be together on this incredibly important mission of making sure that we change our guidelines. That is really the only way. Each one of us can make decisions about what we eat, and hopefully we can persuade our loved ones, although it's very hard when, their doctors are telling them something else. But I think until the expert advice changes, we really will not see the kind of change that we need in schools and food in hospitals and, food for our militaries. All of that really depends on changing the guidelines. And so I think they really need to change, and I think we need to work together to do that. So I am going to post, if it's all right, a link to a petition that has been started by the Nutrition Coalition, and I would urge you all to sign it. And for more great stories on science being ignored, suppressed, and scientists being bullied, I recommend my book, which I think is still really relevant. And a nutrition thriller is what The Economist called it. It really is an incredible, amazing story. You just cannot believe how we've been lied to for so many decades. And that is The Big Fat Surprise, and you can get that on Amazon. And maybe other places too, I don't know. But thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for watching. Hello to everyone. And also, I am going to say this. I do love Adapt bars. They're hugely popular in our home. So, great. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.